December 1944. The grey winter clouds over the Ardennes hung low like a ceiling of lead. Beneath them, the forests of Western Germany stretched endlessly, silent, cold and waiting. The war had entered its brutal final act, but in the air danger remained absolute. Every pilot in the 9th Air Force knew one rule above all others: never dive below regulation altitude without direct clearance. Low altitude meant death. Flak, machine guns, trees. Death hid everywhere beneath the clouds. Yet on this day, one American pilot would break that rule, and in seconds alter the course of an entire Luftwaffe operation. The P-47 Thunderbolt hummed through the haze, its engine steady but strained. The pilot, Lieutenant John Merritt of the 405th Fighter Group, scanned the ground below. Radio chatter had gone quiet. His squadron was finishing a routine patrol near the German border, where enemy movements had been strangely erratic for days. Reports suggested the Luftwaffe was retreating, but Merritt, like many combat veterans, trusted instinct more than reports. The land below looked wrong, too quiet, too still. Smoke plumes from distant shelling rose lazily through the fog, but one area of forest appeared strangely undisturbed, as though untouched by months of battle. The map in his cockpit showed nothing there, no village, no road, no target. Yet his gut whispered otherwise. His orders were clear: maintain 8,000 feet, complete the circuit, return to base. But Merritt's eyes caught something. A faint glimmer in the tree line, a reflection of metal perhaps, just for an instant. He couldn't be sure. The haze shifted again, erasing it like a ghost. He hesitated. His hand tightened on the control stick. He radioed command. No response. Static. Silence. For a moment the only sound was the throaty roar of the engine and the ticking in his own ears. Then, against all training, he nosed the Thunderbolt downward. The altimeter spun. The clouds rushed up to meet him. The world narrowed to a grey tunnel of motion and instinct. This was no sanctioned maneuver. It was a forbidden dive into the unknown. And waiting beneath that cloud cover was one of the Luftwaffe's most dangerous secrets still on the move. By late 1944, the sky over Europe no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. The once dominant German air arm was broken, its fighter wings shattered by months of attrition. The Allies ruled the air, their bombers striking German cities by day and night, their fighter bombers hunting convoys, rail lines and bridges with ruthless precision. Yet even in victory, the air war was far from safe. Each mission was a gamble. Pilots faced unpredictable weather, low visibility, and a desperate enemy who hid in the forests and valleys of a collapsing front. The US 9th Air Force, to which Lieutenant John Merritt belonged, had been forged for this exact kind of warfare: fast, low-altitude support for advancing ground troops. Their P-47 Thunderbolts were flying tanks, thick-skinned, heavy and brutally powerful. They could dive at nearly 500 miles per hour and carry bombs, rockets and machine guns enough to erase an entire column of vehicles. But the command's fear was justified. Flying too low over German territory was suicide. Anti-aircraft fire could shred a plane in seconds, and losing experienced pilots was a cost the Allies could no longer afford. Orders were strict. Altitude minimums had to be respected. Reconnaissance aircraft, not fighter bombers, were tasked to scout below the clouds. Merritt knew these rules by heart. Yet by December, the lines between caution and necessity were blurring. The Germans had begun concealing fuel convoys and troop movements beneath camouflage nets in deep forest corridors, relying on overcast weather to escape detection. Allied bombers flying high above could see nothing through the thick winter mist. Only daring pilots who flew dangerously low stood a chance of spotting what the Luftwaffe wanted hidden. On the ground, intelligence units warned of unusual Luftwaffe fuel transfers near the Ardennes. Command suspected the enemy was stockpiling for something, but no one knew what. The reports were vague, the evidence fragmentary, and in this fog of uncertainty, every decision mattered. Pilots like Merritt, flying daily over a wounded but still defiant Germany, were both hunters and scouts, men expected to strike hard, yet obey orders to the letter. That impossible balance, obedience versus instinct, was what defined the air war's final months. And for one man, that balance was about to collapse completely. Lieutenant John Merritt had been flying combat missions since the summer of 1944. He was 24, the son of a Kansas farmer, and by December, he had logged more than 120 flight hours in combat zones. His aircraft, a P-47 Thunderbolt named Ruthless Rose after his fiancée back home, bore the scars of its service, patched bullet holes along the fuselage and faded nose art, dulled by months of European rain. Merritt's squadron, the 510th Fighter Squadron of the 405th Fighter Group, operated from a muddy airfield hastily carved out in northern France. Their mission profile was simple in writing, but deadly in practice: seek, destroy, and disrupt German movement. Each morning before dawn, mechanics prepped the Thunderbolts, fueling and arming them with 500-pound bombs and 850 caliber machine guns. By sunrise, the roar of engines shook the frost from the ground as they took off in formation toward Germany. The men of the 405th were a tight-knit brotherhood, pilots bound not by rank but by survival. They lived in tents, ate powdered rations, and joked grimly about flak bursts that bloomed like black flowers around them. Their commanding officer, Colonel Gerald Red Warren, enforced discipline but respected instinct. Still, his standing order was absolute: no unauthorized dives below 5,000 feet. Ever. The cost of disobedience was not just disciplinary, it was often fatal. The Luftwaffe's 88mm anti-aircraft guns could reach anything that strayed too low. Merritt's reputation was mixed. He was a skilled pilot, aggressive but level-headed. He had saved his wingman during a dogfight in August and destroyed 4 armored vehicles in a single run near Aachen. But he was also known for flying by feel, trusting his instincts more than his instruments. His comrades teased him, calling him farmer's gut. He laughed it off, though deep down he knew that same instinct had kept him alive. On the morning of the fateful mission, Merritt's squadron received new orders: routine patrol over a stretch of German forest near Euskirchen. Intelligence suggested scattered German transport activity, nothing significant. It was meant to be another day of watchful flying, perhaps one strafing run, then back for lukewarm coffee and mechanical repairs. None of them knew that hidden beneath those very forests was a moving artery of the Luftwaffe, a fuel convoy carrying the lifeblood for a final counterstrike still forming in secret. The briefing tent was cold, the kind of damp chill that crawled through uniforms and into bone. A single lantern flickered over a map pinned to plywood. Colonel Gerald Red Warren stood beside it, his cap pulled low, a cigarette burning down between his fingers. Around him, half a dozen pilots huddled close, steam rising from their breath, the smell of oil, canvas, and burnt coffee mixed with tension. "Gentlemen," Warren began, tapping his pointer at the shaded grid on the map, "today's patrol is a recon assist over Sector Blue 6. The Krauts are pulling fuel east through these forest corridors, roads too narrow for armor, perfect for hiding trucks. But you are not to drop below 5,000 feet. You see movement, mark coordinates, call it in and move on. No cowboy stunts today." His tone was even, but the meaning clear. Too many pilots had died chasing shadows through fog. Lieutenant Merritt studied the map in silence. He knew the area: dense woods, winding roads, little room to maneuver. It was the kind of terrain where the Luftwaffe's supply convoys could move unseen. The mission sounded routine, but his gut told him otherwise. When the briefing ended, Warren caught his eye. "Merritt," he said quietly, "I know your instincts. Keep them in check. You're one of my best sticks. Don't make me ground you for doing something stupid." Merritt nodded. "Understood, sir." Out on the airfield, mechanics tightened bolts and armed rockets under the metallic hum of engines warming up. The ground was slick with frost. Boots crunched over ice. Crew Chief Sergeant Dale Henson slapped the side of Ruthless Rose as Merritt climbed into the cockpit. "Sky's thick today," Henson shouted. "Stay high or you'll fly right into hell." Merritt gave a thumbs up, adjusting his oxygen mask. Above him, other Thunderbolts were already rolling toward takeoff. At 0820 hours, the squadron lifted from the frozen strip, engines howling through the fog, formations spread across the grey morning sky, each P-47 climbing to its assigned altitude. Below them stretched a world of shadow and smoke, villages smouldering, forests shrouded in white mist, rivers glazed with ice. As they crossed the border into Germany, radio chatter crackled through the headsets. Sector Blue 6 inbound. Visibility 2 miles, no targets confirmed. It was routine, mechanical, procedural. But as the formation reached its waypoint, Merritt noticed something odd on the horizon, a strange gap in the tree line where the snow seemed darker. His instinct stirred again. Orders were orders, but something below was moving. The air above Western Germany felt different that morning. Heavier, slower, like the sky itself was holding its breath. Lieutenant John Merritt adjusted his altitude, the Thunderbolt's canopy frosting slightly along the edges. He could see the Rhine's silver curve glinting faintly through gaps in the cloud cover. Below, the forests looked almost serene, snow-coated and untouched by war. But Merritt knew better. He had flown over too many quiet landscapes that turned out to be killing grounds. His instruments hummed steadily, fuel steady, ammo locked. The radio crackled. 510, this is lead, maintain grid pattern. No targets. Returning to standard course, he acknowledged, but his eyes stayed fixed on the tree line. Something about the shadows down there felt deliberate, too clean, too aligned to be natural. The rest of the formation banked east, their silver wings vanishing into fog. Merritt leveled out at 8,000 feet, maintaining his sector alone. His wingman, Lieutenant Harris, was a few miles north, his voice steady through the radio. Nothing on my end. Roads look dead. Merritt hesitated before replying. Copy, keep scanning the ridge near those pines. Looks odd. Silence followed, broken only by faint static. The clouds below churned like smoke, swallowing the earth. As he crossed into a low valley, Merritt spotted it again, a flicker of light deep between the trees. It vanished instantly. Then another, smaller glint, like the sun reflecting off metal. It couldn't be water. It was too rhythmic. His stomach tightened. The Luftwaffe had become masters of camouflage, painting trucks to look like barns, laying fake snow over tanks, stringing nets across roads invisible from above. But glints like that? Those were real. Something metallic was moving where nothing should move. He radioed Harris again, no response. Static hissed, then silence. The radio net had gone dead. Jamming or weather, he couldn't tell. Merritt's hand hovered near the throttle. Every instinct screamed to descend, to see what lay beneath those clouds. But Warren's voice echoed in his head. You go below 5,000 feet and you're asking to die. Still, the image of those unnatural reflections burned behind his eyes. He pictured fuel trucks, aircraft transports, perhaps even bomb-laden vehicles headed for frontline airfields. If they reached their destination, hundreds of Allied airmen could die. If he stayed high, they'd vanish forever into the forest. The Thunderbolt rumbled, eager beneath his grip. He looked at the altimeter, 7,800 feet. His breath fogged the glass. To hell with it, he muttered. He pushed the stick forward. The nose dipped. Gravity pulled. The engine screamed. The clouds surged upward to swallow him whole. The grey curtain of clouds swallowed Merritt's aircraft as the altimeter needle spun downward, 7,000 feet. 6,000, 5,500. The world outside the cockpit dissolved into vapor and vibration. Ice formed along the wings. The roaring engine was the only sound left in existence. His oxygen mask pressed tight against his face as the pressure shifted. Then suddenly he broke through. Below him, the German forest unfurled like a shadowed sea. Rows of pine and birch, dusted with snow, stretching as far as the horizon. But it wasn't empty. Something about the pattern of the trees caught his eye. Lines, straight, deliberate lines. Merritt blinked, leaned forward. There, between two ridges, a narrow clearing that wasn't marked on his map. A thin road cut through it, half covered by woven camouflage nets like scars across the white. He throttled back, scanning. The air shimmered faintly above the treetops. Heat distortion. That shouldn't exist in sub-zero temperatures, unless there were engines running below. He dropped another 1,000 feet, heart pounding. The Thunderbolt vibrated as wind buffeted its thick wings. Now he could see faint movement, a line of shapes under the nets, trucks, dozens of them. At first they looked like transport carriers, but Merritt caught sight of something larger. A flatbed hauling what appeared to be aircraft fuselage sections, wrapped in canvas. His breath caught. Fuel trucks. Supply vehicles. He realized in an instant what he was looking at. A Luftwaffe supply convoy, camouflaged and waiting for orders to move. The convoy was positioned in perfect concealment, parked under overlapping nets, surrounded by trees, hidden from high-altitude bombers and reconnaissance flights. No smoke trails, no open fires, just engines running low to stay warm. Merritt circled once, just enough to confirm what his gut had already told him. It was massive. At least 20 trucks, several tankers, and what might have been mobile repair equipment. He knew the Luftwaffe had been crippled by fuel shortages. If this convoy reached its destination, it could refuel entire fighter squadrons or power a renewed offensive. The Allies had been wondering how Germany was still sustaining aircraft operations. This was part of the answer. But now came the question that knotted every muscle in Merritt's body. What should he do? Protocol demanded that he return to altitude, mark coordinates and radio base. Yet the radio was still dead, static only. If he climbed back into the clouds, the convoy could disperse within minutes, gone before any strike team could reach it. The longer he stared at the scene below, the more he felt the weight of the moment. His orders said to hold. His instincts said to act, and instinct had never failed him yet. He took one slow breath, tightened his harness, and pushed the throttle forward until the Thunderbolt growled like a living thing. The decision was made. Lieutenant John Merritt gritted his teeth as the Thunderbolt tipped into a steep descent, slicing through the frozen air like a falling blade. The roar of the Pratt & Whitney engine filled the cockpit, a deep metallic growl that drowned every doubt. The altimeter spun faster, 4,500 feet, 300, 3,000. Below him the forest blurred into a dark green streak. The risk was absolute. One misjudged angle, one hidden flak cannon, and ruthless Rose would vanish into the trees. But Merritt's mind was clear now. Every sound, every vibration felt sharpened into focus. He was committed. The convoy below hadn't yet noticed him. Their camouflage, perfect from altitude, failed against his screaming dive. Through his gun sight, the shapes beneath the nets resolved into detail. Fuel trucks, trailers, flatbeds with spare aircraft engines lashed under tops. A Luftwaffe fuel column, real and enormous. Merritt's pulse thudded in his helmet. He adjusted the trim, aligning the first cluster of vehicles dead center in his sight. He flipped the arming switches. 2 500-pound bombs locked hot. 8 50-caliber machine guns hummed ready. At 2,500 feet, he pressed the trigger. The world below erupted. Twin bombs fell true, streaking past his canopy like black stones. A heartbeat later, the forest split open in light and thunder. Orange flame and black smoke tore upward through the snow, blasting trees apart, flipping trucks into the air. Merritt pulled hard on the stick, the G-forces crushing him into his seat as ruthless Rose clawed upward. He heard the sharp ping of flak bursting behind him, but he was already banking for another pass. Below, chaos consumed the road. German soldiers scrambled from vehicles, firing blindly into the sky. Flames spread across the tree line, devouring camouflage nets. Merritt circled, assessing the wreckage. Dozens of trucks still burned, but some remained intact. Fuel tankers likely filled with aviation gasoline. He couldn't leave them. He dove again, lower this time, barely 300 feet above the ground. The Thunderbolt's guns spat fire, tracers slashing through the smoke. Bullets ripped through truck cabins. One tanker erupted in a column of flame so bright it turned the forest to daylight. A shockwave buffeted his aircraft. Fragments clanged against the fuselage. His canopy rattled but held. He climbed sharply, lungs burning. Through the haze of smoke below, he saw a sight few pilots ever did. A convoy annihilated in seconds, the Luftwaffe's hidden lifeline engulfed in its own fuel. The decision he'd made, the forbidden dive, had lasted barely a minute, but its consequences would ripple far beyond that road. Behind him, the forest glowed red against the snow. Merritt steadied the throttle, heart pounding, aware of every warning light on his console. He'd broken orders, violated altitude, and risked his life without clearance. But as he turned west, one thought burned steady in his mind. Some rules are meant to be broken when the stakes are this high. As Merritt leveled off from his final pass, the world below was a burning mosaic of destruction. The once hidden road was now a trail of fire stretching through the forest, each blast exposing the full scale of what he'd stumbled upon. Beneath shredded camouflage nets lay dozens of ruined trucks, some carrying aircraft wings, others crumpled fuel tankers, their contents pooling into infernos that rolled across the snow like liquid flame. The trees themselves burned with a sickly blue glow from ignited aviation fuel, turning the winter landscape into a vision of hell. Through his canopy, Merritt could see figures running between the wrecks, Luftwaffe mechanics and drivers, their uniforms catching the firelight as they tried in vain to drag wounded comrades from the blaze. He climbed back to 2,000 feet, catching his breath, the oxygen mask pressing into his skin. His hands trembled slightly on the controls. He'd done what no one had ordered him to do, and in that act, uncovered something no Allied commander had known existed. He circled once more, capturing the full picture in his mind, long enough to commit the coordinates to memory. What had looked like a routine supply line was clearly something far larger. This was a fuel and transport hub for the Luftwaffe's reorganization effort, a logistical artery feeding what intelligence later confirmed was the last major German counteroffensive plan of the war, the groundwork for what would soon become the Ardennes offensive. Known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, the convoy's cargo told its own story. Every truck bore markings from different airfields, Cologne, Kassel, Treue. Merritt spotted 2 flatbeds carrying Me-262 jet engine components, rare and vital to Germany's experimental jet program. If this column had reached its destination, it could have helped fuel not just aircraft, but an attempt to re-establish Luftwaffe operations during the critical weeks ahead. He realized in a jolt of awe that his impulsive dive hadn't just hit a target, it had struck at the very veins of Germany's air war recovery effort. As he banked west to head for base, flak erupted behind him, delayed but determined. Black puffs burst around his tail, but none found their mark. He had stirred a hornet's nest. The Germans below were radioing furiously, sending panicked reports through shattered communications networks. He'd been lucky, seconds slower and he would have been torn from the sky. At 4,000 feet, Merritt switched radio frequencies, his voice shaking slightly as he broke the static. Base, this is 510 Red 2, confirm contact. Repeat, enemy fuel convoy destroyed. Coordinates following. Static answered at first, then a crackled voice. Red 2, say again. Destroyed. Merritt exhaled. Affirmative. Entire column neutralized. Forests on fire. You'll see the smoke from France. He had no idea yet that his discovery would rewrite the next day's mission orders for the entire 9th Air Force, and that within 24 hours, those same coordinates would become a new Allied target grid, forever marked in the records as one of the most effective solo strikes of the war. By the time Merritt crossed back over the Allied line, the adrenaline that had carried him through the dive began to fade, replaced by a creeping mix of disbelief and exhaustion. His gloves were slick with sweat despite the cold. His flight suit clung to him like a second skin. The P-47's engine roared evenly, but the airframe trembled faintly from the strain of its violent maneuvers. A small crack ran along the lower edge of his canopy, probably from debris or flak. He didn't care. Behind him, the German forest was still burning. Even from 15 miles away, he could see the column of smoke punching through the clouds, an unmistakable black scar against the winter sky. He switched radio frequencies again, this time reaching command relays near Liège. 510 Red 2 returning from patrol. Encountered heavy ground movement. Grid K6 by L2. Convoy destroyed. Repeat, multiple secondary explosions. There was silence, then a clipped, disbelieving voice. Red 2, confirm. Are you alone? Merritt exhaled slowly. Affirmative. Lost contact with flight. Target verified. Significant fire and fuel detonation. Suggest photo recon immediately. The line went dead again, replaced by interference. At this altitude, reception was unreliable, but he hoped the message had gone through. The landscape below him shifted from forest to patchy farmland. Columns of Allied armor crawled eastward, their tracks cutting through the snow like black veins. Somewhere down there, thousands of soldiers were advancing, unaware that one pilot's forbidden maneuver had just erased the fuel meant to meet them head-on. Inside the cockpit, the smell of oil and cordite still lingered. Merritt checked his ammo counters, nearly depleted. He replayed the attack in his mind. Every moment burned into memory. The dive angle, the flicker of tracers, the eruption of flame. The clarity of it was surreal, almost detached. He wondered fleetingly if he'd gone too far. He had disobeyed a direct standing order. If his report reached the wrong officer first, he could face grounding or worse. But as he looked once more at that towering pillar of smoke, he knew he wouldn't have changed a thing. Crossing the Rhine Valley, his fuel gauge dipped low. He throttled back, easing ruthless rows toward friendly airspace. The clouds ahead were lit faintly by the pale afternoon sun, turning gold against the grey. It was almost peaceful, an illusion of calm that war rarely allowed. Somewhere behind him, the Luftwaffe's logistical heart was collapsing in fire. He had seen it, caused it, and now he had to answer for it. As his home field came into view, a frozen strip lined with olive-drab tents and snow-coated Thunderbolts, Merritt steadied his approach. His landing gear locked with a clunk. Over the radio, the control tower's voice cracked through. "Red 2, you're trailing smoke." "You okay?" He smiled faintly under his mask. "Affirmative, Tower. Just need a patch and some coffee." The wheels hit the ground hard, bouncing once before gripping the runway. When the engine finally shut down, silence settled heavy around him. The mission was over, but the reckoning was about to begin. Deep inside the western forest, chaos consumed what had once been a meticulously hidden convoy. German soldiers stumbled through fire and smoke, shouting orders no one could hear over the roar of burning fuel. Flames rose 30 meters high, twisting the air into shimmering waves. The once precise formation of trucks had become a graveyard of metal and ash. Some drivers had thrown themselves into the snow, rolling to extinguish burning uniforms. Others worked frantically to unhook vehicles not yet consumed, only for the heat to ignite them seconds later. Ammunition boxes detonated one after another, scattering lethal fragments across the clearing. Oberleutnant Karl Eisen, the convoy's security officer, crawled from the wreckage of his command car, coughing through the stench of gasoline. He could barely see. The smoke turned daylight into twilight. His men had been confident, even complacent. They'd been told Allied planes couldn't see through the winter fog, that their camouflage was perfect. The low drone of aircraft engines had come as a shock, and by the time they'd looked up, it was already too late. The American fighter had fallen from the clouds like a hawk, unleashed hell and vanished before a single gun crew could react. Radio operators scrambled to re-establish contact with divisional command. Their equipment had been knocked out by the first explosion, but survivors eventually transmitted a short, frantic message: "Enemy aircraft, lone fighter, entire column destroyed." The reply that came minutes later was terse, bordering on disbelief. "Impossible. Confirm identification. Allied bombers not active in your sector." Eisen stared at the charred remains around him and muttered bitterly, "Then tell them to look out the window." The destruction went far beyond physical loss. This convoy had been part of a critical Luftwaffe fuel transfer to support air operations tied to Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, the German counteroffensive soon to erupt in the Ardennes. Without that fuel, dozens of planned sorties would be cancelled, delaying the coordination between air and ground elements that were supposed to support Hitler's last gamble. By nightfall, the survivors had managed to pull the last of the wounded from the fire. The forest still glowed in embers, smoke rising into the cold air like the ghost of their failure. Eisen filed his report by lamplight, each word a wound. Convoy annihilated by single Allied aircraft, probable P-47, total loss of fuel and materiel. Casualties heavy. When the message reached Corps headquarters, it was met with silence. For the Luftwaffe's supply network, this was not just a setback, it was a humiliation. Across Germany that evening, radar stations and patrol units were put on alert for lone raiders, diving from low cloud cover. But none appeared. The pilot responsible was already hundreds of kilometers away, his plane cooling in the frost of a quiet French airfield. The fire in the forest burned for 2 days straight. And in the offices of the Luftwaffe's command staff, planners began to realize that one American fighter had undone weeks of preparation, proof that Allied dominance no longer depended on numbers alone, but on initiative. The moment Lieutenant Merritt rolled Ruthless Rose to a stop on the frozen tarmac, the ground crew rushed forward. Steam hissed from the cowling. Smoke still curled faintly from the exhausts. Sergeant Dale Henson yanked open the canopy, shouting over the ticking engine metal. "What the hell did you hit out there?" Merritt removed his oxygen mask and simply pointed east. Even from the airfield, a dark smear of smoke was visible on the horizon, rising higher than any weather front. Henson stared for a second, then gave a low whistle. "You're gonna have some explaining to do." Inside the operations tent, the air reeked of damp wool and gasoline heaters. Colonel Warren stood over the intelligence table, his cap tucked under one arm, when Merritt entered still in flight gear. The room went quiet. The colonel didn't speak right away. He just looked at the young pilot's face, blackened with soot, eyes still wide with adrenaline, and then said evenly, "Report." Merritt described it all, the glint through the clouds, the break in the tree line, the trucks, the engines, the explosions. He drew quick circles on a map, tracing the road's path with a pencil. Intelligence officers listened in silence, noting coordinates, occasionally glancing at one another. When he finished, Warren folded his arms. "You're telling me you dove below 3,000 feet without clearance?" "Yes, sir." "And you engaged without confirmation?" "Yes, sir." "And you destroyed an entire German fuel column single-handed?" Merritt hesitated, then nodded once. "Yes, sir." The colonel's eyes narrowed. "You realize I should ground you for that?" Merritt didn't respond. The silence stretched until one of the intelligence men, a captain from 9th Air Force headquarters, spoke. "Sir, we've been tracking missing fuel convoys in that sector for a week. If Lieutenant Merritt's coordinates are correct, he just found them." Warren looked back down at the map, the tension in his jaw easing slightly. "Get reconnaissance up there before sundown. If he's right, we'll know soon enough." Hours later, as Merritt sat outside the briefing hut nursing a cup of coffee gone cold, 2 reconnaissance P-38s roared eastward. Dusk settled over the field, the horizon still faintly tinted by smoke. No one spoke to him except Henson, who brought a blanket and muttered, "Whatever happens, that was one hell of a shot." Merritt gave a tired grin. "Yeah," he said quietly, "if they don't court-martial me first." He didn't know that the photographs returning within hours would confirm everything. A 20-vehicle convoy reduced to twisted wreckage, burning fuel visible from 30 miles away. The report would climb the chain of command before dawn. And when it reached headquarters, the man they'd almost grounded would suddenly become the pilot who had changed the day's intelligence picture entirely. The next morning, the reconnaissance photographs arrived, still damp from the developer trays. They were spread across the operations table like a deck of cards, each image darker and more unbelievable than the last. Black smoke poured from what had once been a tree-covered corridor. Vehicles lay in spirals of twisted metal. Even from the aerial perspective, the violence of the explosion was unmistakable. Colonel Warren studied the prints in silence, jaw set, as the intelligence captain flipped them over one by one. "That's your sector, Colonel. Grid K6, exactly where Merritt marked it." He pointed to a series of overlapping craters, fuel trucks, repair trailers, and at least 2 flatbeds hauling aircraft parts. He hit something big. Word traveled fast. Within hours, the photographs reached the 9th Air Force headquarters near Chartres, then filtered up to the Tactical Air Command. Analysts compared the destroyed vehicles' markings to captured logistics reports and confirmed what Merritt had only guessed. The convoy had been a major Luftwaffe fuel column supporting operations in the Eifel region, directly tied to Germany's planned counteroffensive along the Ardennes front. Without that fuel, multiple airfields would be forced to ground their remaining fighters. The report's conclusion was simple and stunning. Loss of target will delay Luftwaffe resupply operations by no less than 72 hours. For Allied planners preparing for unpredictable German resistance, that delay was invaluable. 3 days in a war of attrition meant thousands of Allied troops would live to fight another sunrise. Colonel Warren called Merritt back into the briefing hut that afternoon. The young pilot entered quietly, unsure whether to salute or brace for reprimand. Warren didn't look up right away. He just placed the reconnaissance photo in front of him. "That's your work?" Merritt nodded once. "So yes, sir." The colonel studied him for a long moment before saying, "You broke protocol, disobeyed altitude restriction, and acted without confirmation." He paused. "You also destroyed a key Luftwaffe convoy that none of our intelligence units even knew existed. You may have just saved more men than I can count." Merritt stood silent, unsure how to respond. Warren gave a faint smile, half pride, half disbelief. "The brass want your statement for the record. Don't embellish it. Just tell them what you saw. And for God's sake, don't ever pull that stunt again." By nightfall, the 9th Air Force issued a revised operations order. All reconnaissance flights over the Eifel forests would now include low-altitude verification passes, if conditions allowed. The phrase Merritt Protocol began circulating among pilots, a darkly humorous nickname for the rule born from his defiance. Somewhere beyond the front lines, the Luftwaffe's remaining fuel trucks tried to reroute, forced to travel only by night. But their momentum had been broken. One pilot's forbidden dive had exposed a weakness far larger than he ever intended. That evening, as the mess tent filled with laughter and radio music, Merritt sat quietly with his coffee, reading the day's dispatch. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt only relief, the kind that came after realizing instinct for once had been right. In the days that followed, Lieutenant Merritt's unauthorized strike became a quiet legend within the 9th Air Force. His report circulated through command channels, annotated in pencil by analysts and officers alike. Phrases like exceptional initiative under duress appeared alongside warnings about disobedience. To some, he was a model of instinctive combat leadership. To others, a dangerous example of emotion overriding order. But when the full intelligence assessment arrived, even the skeptics went silent. The destroyed convoy had contained over 80,000 gallons of aviation fuel, enough to power several Luftwaffe squadrons during their planned counteroffensive. In effect, Merritt's attack had grounded dozens of German fighters before they could even leave their hangars. Reconnaissance over the next 2 days revealed further consequences. German supply units had abandoned secondary roads entirely, forced to move only at night and under heavier camouflage. Allied ground forces pushing east reported significantly fewer Luftwaffe strafing runs. A single moment of instinct had reshaped an entire sector's tempo. For Merritt, the results were less clear-cut. He was summoned to headquarters for formal review, a procedural necessity for any pilot who disobeyed orders. The hearing was brief but tense. When asked if he understood the risk he had taken, Merritt replied simply, "Yes, sir. But I also understood what we stood to lose if I didn't." The board conferred privately for several minutes, then dismissed him without penalty. The official report classified his action as unauthorized but justified. Back at the airfield, his squadron welcomed him with quiet pride. They didn't cheer or toast. Such gestures felt wrong in a war that took friends almost daily. But when Merritt climbed into Ruthless Rose for his next mission, every man on the line stopped to watch. Someone had painted a small lightning bolt beneath the cockpit window with the words, "The Forbidden Dive." News of the strike filtered outward slowly, mentioned in briefings but never in newspapers. Official communiqué referred only to Allied fighter-bomber activity disrupting German logistics. The true story of one pilot's rule-breaking act that crippled a Luftwaffe supply chain remained, buried in after-action reports and declassified intelligence years later. Yet, its effects rippled through Allied doctrine. Commanders began rethinking strict altitude limitations, allowing pilots more discretion when conditions demanded it. The air war was evolving, less about rigid command, more about adaptability and initiative. Merritt's dive had unintentionally become a case study in modern air combat judgment. For Merritt himself, the mission never left his mind. He wrote in his logbook that night, his handwriting tight and deliberate, December 14th, 1944, engaged enemy convoy. Target destroyed. Broke every rule I swore to follow. Don't regret it. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything he had risked. His career, his life and the trust of his command. Beyond the front lines, snow continued to fall over the ruined forest where the convoy had burned. The charred remains of the trucks lay half-buried in ice, silent evidence of a moment when instinct had rewritten the course of war. When the war ended months later, the story of Lieutenant John Merritt's forbidden dive never made the headlines. It was buried among thousands of operational reports, one more mission in a sky filled with them. But those who had read the photographs and the intelligence memos knew the truth. His decision in the span of 60 seconds had destroyed a critical artery of the Luftwaffe and delayed the last major German air counterattack of the war. In a conflict shaped by numbers and machines, his act proved that instinct, human judgment, still held the power to alter history. After Germany's surrender, Merritt returned home quietly. There was no ceremony waiting at the airfield, no medals on his chest. He stepped off the transport plane in Kansas with only his duffel bag and a folded photograph of Ruthless Rose. He went back to farming, back to the open fields that now felt too still after years of sky and engine thunder. His neighbors saw only another young veteran returning home. They never knew that his single defiant dive had echoed across an entire theater of war. In 1946, an internal Air Force study cited his mission as an example of tactical initiative under uncertain communication, arguing for greater pilot autonomy in reconnaissance and strike operations. It was a quiet acknowledgement that courage and reason could coexist within disobedience. Years later, his name appeared in training manuals under case studies for target of opportunity engagement. It was the closest thing to recognition he would ever receive. The forest where he'd made his dive still bore the scars long after the fires died out. Allied engineers who surveyed the area found melted steel and glass fused into the soil, remnants of trucks that had carried the last hope of a defeated air force. Villagers spoke of the night the sky fell without warning, a single plane emerging from the clouds, striking like thunder and vanishing as quickly as it came. To them it was less a battle than a visitation, a moment when the war itself seemed to pass overhead and end in fire. History remembers wars by their grand offensives, the D-Day landings, the Bulge, Berlin. But within those vast campaigns are moments small enough to fit inside the silence of one man's decision. Merritt's forbidden dive was one of those moments, unseen, uncelebrated, but decisive. It was proof that the outcome of great wars often depends not on orders written in headquarters, but on the fleeting courage of a single mind, guided by instinct. He never spoke much about it afterward. When asked by another veteran what it felt like to dive alone into enemy territory, Merritt only smiled faintly and said, "It felt like doing what needed to be done." The skies he once ruled returned to peace. The forest grew back over the scars. But the legacy of that dive, the lesson that discipline and instinct are both tools of victory, remained echoing through generations of pilots who would one day face their own moment of choice.